Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this visiting speaker talk / special edition of the Monday Majlis. I'm immensely grateful to Vinay for coming. It has been quite a journey, this meeting itself, because in Exeter every week we have a visiting speaker, and this was to be Vinay, but then our co-organizers, the Train and the employees of Train, they decided not to work today, so Vinay couldn't come. And then luckily, previously we decided to go hybrid, and now we go online only, and we have Vinay with us, which is fantastic. And yes, thank you for your flexibility in this. Also, we have a very, very busy beginning of the term, the center. And I just want to mention, just before we start, that the next edition of the Monday Majlis will be on Monday this time, and it will be Parvane Pourshariati on sharing wives and drinking wine, the Mazdakis, the Ayars, and the Mitraist, accusations and realities. You can see this in the chat. I put it there, and of course it's also advertised. And then next Wednesday we will have Hafsa Kanjwal on colonizing Kashmir, state building under Indian occupation, and that will be hopefully in person and online as well. And you know, we also welcome suggestions for speakers. And Vinay, inviting Vinay was not my brilliant idea; it was Sajjad's brilliant idea. So I let Sajjad to introduce you properly, Vinay, and then Vinay will continue with the Monday Majlis format. So he will introduce, he will guide us through his own journey, and then we go to the topic of today's Majlis, which is, I would say, the Shīʿī and the Sunni Fatima. So in different images of Fatima and memories of Fatima and their implications. I will mute myself, and then that takes on, and then.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see everyone online, at least. Let me just say a quick few things about Vinay as a few words of introduction. I've known Vinay, I think, for a few years now. We've interacted in different contexts. I last saw him when I was over in Toronto on his kind invitation a few months ago. He's currently the academic director of the Shīʿī Research Institute, which is a new academic institute established in Toronto, which is seeking to encourage research on Shīʿī Islam, 12-verse Shīʿī Islam primarily, but actually does have a slightly broader remit of that. And it will be engaged in a rather ambitious set of publications, research agendas, workshops, and so forth. And it would be really nice to see people getting involved, both at Exeter and elsewhere, in this sort of, particularly the world of people working on Shīʿī studies, but also on early Islam. He received his MA in History and Philosophy of Religion at Concordia in 2012, and then his PhD in Religious Studies from McMaster relatively recently. You know, it's interesting to look at what he's going to have to say here today. I do know that his dissertation was on a very important and neglected area of research, which is Shīʿī devotional literature. And I'm happy to kind of say that he is contributing a chapter precisely on that topic for the Oxford Handbook of Shīʿī Islam, which I'm editing with Ihab Badawi. And so we're looking forward to Vinay's chapter for that collection, and hopefully we'll get that out in the next 18 months or so. Without any further delay on my part, I will hand over to Vinay, who will speak on his topic of Fatima in sort of Shi'i and Sunni memory. And he'll say a few things about his intellectual journey and then give a presentation, and there will be plenty of time afterwards for discussion. So thank you for agreeing to do this, and over to you, Vinay.
Thank you, Sajat, and thank you to all of you at Exeter for having me. Again, it's too bad I couldn't be there in person, but I guess the trains had something else planned today. But nevertheless, I'm glad to join via Zoom today. A little bit about myself. I've been in academia in different capacities for a long time, for about 20 years, well, a little bit less than that. Yeah, almost 20 years. You know, at the University of Toronto in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies, or Near Eastern Studies, or Near Middle Eastern Studies. I don't remember what it's called exactly, but NMC, where I kind of first cut my teeth on Arabic texts and starting to learn about Islamic history and then religious studies and all those things in the early 2000s. And then went on to study in the Shia Islamic Seminary. I found that was very beneficial, especially from the perspective of learning how to read complex Arabic texts and interpret them and understand them with masters of the tradition. You know, those years in Syria, in Najaf, in London as well, I think were very important complement to my academic journey, especially in being able to investigate and interrogate the original sources. I don't claim to be a master of anything, but it helped me certainly learn them, learn to read them and read alternative interpretations of them, and kind of be almost initiated into the tradition in a sense. While continuing my studies within the Western Academy, I would probably say one of the most beneficial things that I can take from my journey, or especially over the last 13, 15 years maybe, is learning, is an interdisciplinary approach to religious studies and Islamic studies in general. You know, being compelled at times to take courses that perhaps were slightly outside my direct intellectual interests, like anthropology, the sociology of religion, theories and methods, you know, study of Christianity. During my PhD, I had to write a comprehensives on the Christian prayer tradition from Origen to Thomas Merton. So a selection of texts during my qualifying exams with Dr. Peter Whitcomb, who was a student of Rowan Williams, and he's at, I think he's retired now at McMaster. I found that, I studied Augustine with Peter Whitcomb as well while at McMaster. So I found that these studies in things that I probably wouldn't have studied as much if I was just purely in the line of Arabic and classical Islam or Islamic studies was extremely beneficial for me personally, as you know, as someone who is interested in the phenomenon of religion more broadly. And then, of course, a study of anthropology, reading people like Talal Asad, reading Sabah Mahmood, you know, reading these throughout my master's and my PhD, throughout the coursework years, which is probably about 4 or 5 years of coursework between the two, having great professors, you know, who introduced me to important subjects in the field of religious studies more broadly, especially in theories and methods. I think that's something that I would definitely encourage those that are doing religious or Islamic studies right now, is as much as the thesis is important and our individual research silos are important, I think it's good to have a broad understanding of method and theory, and or at least have an awareness of what's out there. So I found that personally very beneficial in my journey. And I had just amazing mentors along the way. Dr. Linda Clark at Concordia, the 2 years with her during my master's, was just absolutely phenomenal studying with her. She's just such an amazing teacher. I'm still in touch with her. She's still, consider her still to be a mentor. having people like Todd Lawson over all these years, from my undergraduate to my PhD. I knew Todd when I was very young, and now I'm invited to speak at his celebration of his career at the Journal of the American Oriental Society. So what a journey I've had with Todd over all these years, from an undergraduate in the early 2000s to now, you know, being honored by Todd to be among those people on the panel to celebrate his career at the Journal of the American Oriental Society coming up in March. So we're just preparing a panel at the moment, myself and Omid, Sebastian Gunther, Tariq Jaffer at that conference in March. So these are some of the people, and of course, Dr. Liaquat Takim. I mean, where do I begin? Again, and just an amazing scholar, someone who has been with me even before I did the PhD with him. I knew him as a community member. I knew him, I was a student of his even before I did my PhD with him, someone who I've known for over 20 years, who's just always been there to support me, to bring new things to my attention. And then he was my PhD supervisor at that time, during my PhD. So that's a little bit about myself. Again, the emphasis upon, I guess, for me is and I guess maybe my advice for if there's any graduate students here at the moment is, break out of your comfort zone. Get out of your comfort zone. Learn about other things within your field. Interact with other scholars and other students. I think one of the best things that I learned throughout my PhD especially is we had joint quarters. So at McMaster, it was a pretty cool program. All the graduate students had offices. And it was in my last year that they took the offices away. So it was really, really cool. So the basement was all the PhD students were down in the basement. And we all had offices that were given to us, but we were randomly thrown in. So you had people working on biblical studies, on anthropology, on something on anthropology, on Islamic studies. You had all these different people, and we grew up, we were all being nurtured and trained together through the years of the program. Some were advanced, some were junior, and we were all together. And those years at McMaster in Toronto with Dr. Takim and others, I think was just such an amazing environment where we would attend conferences, we would attend talks that are totally outside of our immediate comfort zone of what we know or what we specialize in. But then I always found that there's something I could apply often from that to my research. And I think that, throughout my academic journey, I found that to be very important and very useful, and something that the Western Academy, I think, is very good thing about the Western Academy, at least my experience within the Western Academy, that is, whether it be at McMaster or at U of T, or at Concordia with Dr. Linda Clark. It was something that was always emphasized by my mentors all along the way, is to think outside the box, have a broad experience. You'll have many years to write your thesis. You'll have many years to work on their specific Arabic or Persian or Urdu text, whatever you're working on, but try to have a broader understanding of religious tradition, and especially at least Islamic tradition more broadly. So that's something I think is important. I don't want to belabor the point, but yeah. And maybe if I would kind of bring back like a really good memory, I would say it was when I had a chance to really dive deep into Christian mysticism. That was something that was so outside my area of expertise, and developing this sensitivity for other traditions, and sensitivity, an appreciation for the intellectual culture of other traditions outside of the Islamic tradition. I took Talmud when I was doing my master's degree, because that was a requirement. So I actually had studied the Talmud, but I wouldn't say I went that deep, but more in the Christian tradition, studying the spirituality of Augustine and all of these things. Although my paper today has nothing to do with that, but it allows me to, I guess, to engage with different traditions. And again, I would emphasize, at the time, I don't think I was a very willing partner to this. as a graduate student. I said, no, I just want to read Tabari. I want to read my sources. I want to read my tafsirs. I want to read fiqh and usul. I just want to focus on my Arabic language, Arabic texts, and I want to interpret them and read them. And I only want reading courses on these subjects. I don't want to do reading courses on anything else. I don't want to read. I don't want to write papers or being forced to discuss other things. But the departments that I was in just didn't. They were like, no, that's not our approach. Yes, you will specialize in Islamic studies. You will specialize in Arabic. You will specialize in classical Islam, whatever you're doing. Absolutely. You have a committee, you have a thesis supervisor, and you have specialists on that committee who will help you with that. But the first 2 years, you have to take other graduate courses. And these courses were not easy. You'd have to write an essay every week. I remember with Dr. Lawson, we were reading a book per week. So we literally would have to read Rudolf Otto in a week. We would have to read Anne-Marie Schimmel in a week. We would have to read Qurban in a week. You know, like I mean, these were not easy courses, especially with Professor Lawson. And he used to run a 1-year graduate course, running from September to May. So you couldn't get away. And I remember, I'll just end with this. This is part of, you know, a funny story. The course was made up into 2 parts. Actually, Professor Lawson offered this course for me, actually, and essentially, which is on Islamic prayer, which is how kind of him. He says, you know, and you know, when I first met him at the beginning of my doctorate, although I wasn't at U of T, but in Ontario, you could take courses at other universities. And Todd offered this amazing course called Islamic prayer. The course was made up into 2 parts. Part 1 in semester 1 is 200 sources. You have to find 200 sources in any language related to your subject that you want to write on. The goal is 200. I don't think we all hit 200, but 100 of them should be annotated. Can you imagine 100 sources? It could have 1 sentence about your subject related to your subject. And if you don't know the languages, you have to learn them, or you have to find someone who knows them, but you have to include them. That forced me to look at Italian, French, Persian, Arabic, and Todd was unrelenting. And that was an assignment for semester 1 in his doctoral seminar. Assignment for semester 2 was a 50-page paper that at the end could be publication ready or become a chapter of your dissertation. That is not easy. 50 pages he expected. And I remember he wanted it not double-sided. He was very particular about that. He did not like reading double-sided papers, although we all want to save the environment. But I remember double-sided was a no-no for Todd. But the point is that these kinds of graduate seminars, they make you sweat. They're not easy. The standards are exacting, but they train you as a scholar. And when you go on to supervise or to teach other students in the future, you can carry on those that discipline and that rigor, academic rigor, to pass on to your students and apply to your own scholarship. So that's enough about a little bit about grad school. Today, I'm going to be talking about something that I began working on many, many years ago, but have recently resurrected, which is a story of Fatima as a motif of contention and suffering in Islamic sources. I'll begin with a few slides, and then I will read my paper as a traditional paper, and hopefully I will get through my paper. Okay, let me share my screen here. I just have a few slides to begin with, just some thoughts I wanted to begin with today. So I really love this quote of Marshall Hodgson, and I'll just begin with it just because it really kind of encapsulates some of my own ideas and how I kind of approach this subject, which is where he says, in launching the venture of Islam, the events of the first generation after Muhammad were almost as formative as those of Muhammad's own time. It is not accidental that later Muslims have identified themselves in terms of these events and of the factions that grew out of them. They have interpreted the whole of history in symbolism derived from them and have made the interpretation of those events and of the leading personalities in them the very test of religious allegiance. I found this quote, this excerpt from Hodgson's Venture of Islam, just so important. right? He had an amazing, maybe it's again because the influence of reading him with both Todd Lawson and Walid Saleh, like maybe over like 10, 15 years, 15, I don't know how many years ago, but I just love Hodgson. I love the way he explains these things. And for me personally, I think sometimes the way he describes things kind of seeps into my own scholarship. So I found this quote to be particularly instructive when dealing with anything in early Islam, especially. Now, the sources about Fatima and her kind of position in Shiism and Sunnism, particularly as a motif of contention, suffering, and controversy, are numerous, are absolutely numerous. Mind you, there's a lot of repetition. So it's not like these are unique. It's not like each source is unique or each tradition is unique. No, there's a lot of repetition that goes on, of course, from source to source. But it's a lot, about 251 Shia sources, 88 Sunni sources that present some kind of controversy, some kind of conflict, something that is embarrassing, so to speak, for the early community, a kind of early fitna, if you want to call it, kind of early strife, an early element of strife within the nascent, burgeoning, growing Muslim community following the death of the Prophet. So it's by no means something that is, I would say, on the sidelines. It's not something that's on the sidelines. Maybe it's something that's not discussed very often, but it's certainly not on the sidelines. I don't think so. I don't think it could be described that way. The sources are just too many. It's found in too many sources to simply say that it is something, a very kind of shav or nadir or, rare thing. And some of the Sunni sources that I'll be just focusing on Ibn Sa'ad's Tabaqat al-Kubra today. There's Ibn Sa'ad's Tabaqat, Ansab al-Ashraf, Tabari. These are early sources, right? These are early. No, I don't think anyone can deny. I mean, leaving the question of historicity aside, I'll get to that when I begin reading my paper. But these are formative figures, right? These are important people of the early Abbasid and later Abbasid period. Who have contributed to the image and the memory of Muslims, and particularly Sunni Muslims, although Shias would mine from these sources as well. And Ibn Qutayba's Ta'wil Mukhtalif al-Hadith also has an early discussion about this, right? The famous historian and adib. And the common theme of all of these is something happened, but we need to negotiate and we need to save everyone involved. We need to save face of everyone involved, especially the first Khalifa, Abu Bakr. And this would go on to become essentially the predominant Sunni viewpoint, right? Of course, and the whole concept of Adalatu Sahaba or Udulu Sahaba would play an important role as that is being constructed. That would play an important role in in sanitizing everybody's personality and everybody's reputation that was involved. In the conflict between or controversy between Abu Bakr and Umar, or the early Muslim community and the companions on one hand, and Fatima and Ali on the other. And as far as Shia sources, there are so many. Again, I'm not going into whether isnads or whether they're authentic or not. I mean, I'm treating it as a form of memory, as found in early sources. So this memory has been preserved. So clearly there's something important that historians or muhaddithun want to tell us. There's something happened that they want us to let us know about. What actually happened, who knows? I mean, when approaching it from the theory, the method that I've chosen for this, I'm not looking into, the theories of the historical origins of Islam. But the Shia sources are replete. Now, clearly, the Shia sources are very different than the Sunni sources in many ways. As Tusi himself says, and I'll mention in the paper, لا خلاف فيه بين الشيعة أن عمر ضرب على بطنها حتى أسقطت, right? Or أسقطت. I don't know how we can read that differently. فسمي السقط محسنا, right? And there is no dispute among the Shia, according to Sheikh Tusi, this is his opinion, that Omar hit her on her stomach and caused the child to be miscarried, and that child's name is Mohsen. So something really bad took place with the Shias. Something really terrible, really controversial, really abominable from a Shia 12 or Shi'i point of view. At least as far as Tusi says, and Tusi says, La khilaf fihi bayna Shia. Right, so he tries to say that, and there's no disagreement. Of course, everybody claims there's no disagreement when they want to assert their point. I'm not saying that's necessarily true, but clearly, وَالرِّوَايَ بِذَلِكَ مَشْهُورَ عِنْدَهُم. And he says, and the tradition in that regard is famous عِنْدَهُم, meaning يعني أهل Sunnah, or the Sunnis at that time, in 5th century Baghdad. So clear, and then as we see later on, and I'm just going to kind of move to the paper now, this would be a subject of extreme importance. A lot of attention would go into arguing about this. A lot of polemics this would be a subject of intense polemics. We see people like Ibn Qutayba, Sheikh al-Mufid on the Shia side, Sharif al-Murtada, Sheikh Tusi, Abdul Qadir, Sahib al-Mukhni, Asadabadi, right? And others arguing about this. So clearly, especially in the 5th century, this is something of extreme, but of profound controversy. It's important. It's something that has shaped Muslim imagination, both Sunni and Shia, and it's a point of profound contention or parting of ways between the two groups. And we especially see this in the polemical exchanges that occur in the 5th century between the Shia and the Sunnis in Baghdad. And these treatises, or these rasail, or these books have survived until today, giving us an idea of this contested memory. Among the partly undigested material, I'll now read my paper. Among the partly undigested material preserved by the 3rd century historians and biographers and hadith transmitters, both Sunni and Shi'i, are controversial reports indicative of a disorderly atmosphere in which Abu Bakr became caliph following the Saqifa meeting and objections of Ali, Zubair, and Abu Sufyan. Whether these events actually occurred in the way they have been presented is not the concern of this study. The transmission alone is indicative of the creation of a historical record or the historical plausibility of such events occurring for those Muslim historiographers and hadith transmitters responsible for giving shape to it. This historical record is indicative of a continued negotiation with contradictory and varied accounts prior to a time in which Shiite and Sunnite sectarian lines had been fully solidified, and the companions had become beyond reproach in Sunnite Islam. This record, in turn, is precisely what later Shiites would use to advance their doctrinal claims to justify the delegitimization of Sunnite beliefs. As I just mentioned, Tusi tries to mine the Sunni sources for polemical reasons, of course, regarding the upright behavior of the Sahaba. As we shall see, a central figure of these contradictory claims to the past is the figure of Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. These early rivalries among prophetic companions would come, in fact, to function as an arche for both communities. An arche, according to Charles H. Long, is a point designated by religious tradition as its putative beginnings. The conflict and questions regarding the qualities of the various personalities and who was right or wrong thus became extremely important for both Sunnites and Shiites. Inevitably, views became homogenized and polarized on both sides. In light of the above, I would like to again underscore that my concern is not to determine whether these voices actually existed in historical reality. Rather, my aim is to analyze the portrayal of a highly contentious and disputed past, the products of Muslim memory as recounted and preserved by the historians. In what follows, I will try to present as the Fatima Rashidun conflict, so the conflict between those that are described as Khulafa Rashidun, but of course in later sources, right, the 4 rightly guided caliphs, in this case limiting it to 2, Abu Bakr and Umar, in what I described as a Fatima Rashidun conflict through the lens of Ibn Sa'ad's Tabaqat, to try to analyze how both parties have been depicted and possible motivations behind that, which would influence what a particular stream of formative Sunnism would imagine regarding such a conflict. On the other hand, we have Shiite sources which are radically different from their Sunni counterparts. Fatima becomes a touchstone, perhaps along with after Ali's disputed succession itself, where Sunnism and Shiism part ways without any real possibility of reconciliation on this matter, at least for Shiites. Such as even the late Sayyid Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah, the Shīʿī authority, the now deceased Shīʿī authority in Lebanon, while denying the attack on her home. He says that, that it can't be historically proven. He insists that she was a victim of oppression, and the companions who perpetrated that will be held accountable by God. So even this relatively liberal pro-unity clergyman and scholar of Lebanon could not dismiss this, right? So she becomes a very clear, marker of Shi'i identity, even for somebody like Fadlallah, who would advocate unity among Sunnis and Shiites. Now, getting to Muhammad ibn Sa'ad and his Tabaqat al-Kubra, the chief source to examine here regarding the controversy of Fadak. So we're going to be focusing on one element of the controversy between Fatima and the caliphs, which is the controversy of Fadak, or the land that was believed to be left to her in Shi'i thought. So the controversy of Fadak is discussed extensively in the work of Ibn Sa'ad. Ibn Sa'ad was born in Basra in the year 168 or 784 for the Common Era. I don't want to go into all the details. He was a very important early historian. He was ascribed to Al-Waqidi, the famous prophetic biographer. The fruits of his intellectual endeavors are summed up in this massive compendium, which includes the biography of the Prophet, the companions of prominent reporters of hadith, and he also has a section dedicated to the wives, daughters, and female companions. It's quite an important work. It's an early work. It was produced over a century before Tabari's multi-volume history. Debates remain as to whether Ibn Sa'ad can be classified as an akhbari, a historian, or a muhaddith. I'm not going to get into that so much. Nevertheless, probably more so he could be classified as a historian, along with al-Madaini, Hisham al-Kalbi, and others. After all, al-Baraduri was his student. So we could probably classify him more into that category, but his biographies of the early community remains a very important source. His sectarian allegiances are clearly proto-Sunnite, as seen from his positive view of the companions of the Prophet and the hadith folk such as Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Ibn Sa'ad concludes a substantial biography or the seerah of the Prophet with the following subheading: mention of the estate, mirath of the Messenger of God and what he left behind. Matarak. So clearly it's important enough for him to include an entire section in his work on the estate of the Prophet. In this section, Ibn Sa'ad presents a number of reports detailing the disputed ownership and rightful dispensation of Fadak, in addition to other disputed properties such as Khaybar. The sheer length of this section is indicative of the historical religious importance of this subject due to the issues that it symbolized in the scholarly circles of Baghdad in which Ibn Sa'ad participated. First of the traditions indicative of a brewing conflict between Fatima and Abu Bakr has been attributed to Hani, the sister of Ali ibn Abi Talib, a relative latecomer to Islam, but nevertheless someone in a close relationship to the Prophet as his cousin and potential spouse, thus making her a trustworthy source of information and placing her in an ideal position to have witnessed these conversations for the writers or the producers of these reports, that is. The use of specific transmitters alleged to have heard or seen certain contentious events is of great rhetorical value and is indicative of the public nature of such disputes. Hani relates the following: Fatima approached Abu Bakr and asked him the following question: who shall inherit from you when you die? Abu Bakr responds, my son and my progeny. It can be reasonably assumed that Fatima is being portrayed as asking a leading question. So Hani is narrating an interaction between Fatima and Abu Bakr. It can be reasonably assumed that Fatima is being portrayed as asking a leading question of Abu Bakr, in turn desiring that specific answer so that she could assert her right to inherit from her father. Although punctuation did not exist in classical Arabic, the editor of the Arabic text has added an exclamation mark, perhaps to indicate the surprise of Abu Bakr at such an obvious question. It becomes clear that Fatima had come to Abu Bakr with a caustic line of questioning. Fatima then responds, so how is it that you can inherit from the Prophet instead of us? Abu Bakr replies, O daughter of the Messenger of God, I have not inherited from your father a single piece of land or gold or silver or a slave boy or wealth. Fatima once again counters, exclaiming, so the portion, the saham of God, previously possessed by the Prophet, which he, God, has made for us and placed in our possession, and those items left to us, right, safiyatuna, are now in your hand, biyadik. It's an interrogative question. The report then ends with Abu Bakr quoting the Prophet, I heard the Messenger of God say, verily it is a source of food, livelihood bestowed upon me by God, and when I die, it shall be at the disposal of the Muslims. The above passage and similar ones yield several lines of inquiry. Firstly, Fatima began her questioning by comparing her situation with that of Abu Bakr and his heirs, with a perceived logic which stipulated that if Abu Bakr's children could inherit from him, from the Prophet, then, or from Abu Bakr, then why should the daughter of Muhammad not inherit from her father? Consequently, with regard to inheritance and its accompanying laws, Fatima, as illustrated in the Umhani report, saw no distinction between the case of Muhammad as a prophet and Muhammad as a father. Furthermore, it demonstrates that early Muslim historiography depicted Fatima as desiring to enjoy the same rights accorded to the children of Abu Bakr. Thus, by attempting to construct an analogy between Abu Bakr and Muhammad, she was implying that despite Muhammad being a prophet, the laws of inheritance must be universally applied. This comes across more clearly in another report by Ibn Sa'd, in which Fatima, upon being asked to specify her claims to her father's belongings, states the following: Fadak and Khaybar and his, Muhammad's contributions, sadaqatuhu in Medina, I shall inherit these, arathuha, just as your daughters shall inherit from you when you die. Another possible implication of Fatima's argument is a vital theological and legal motif as per the above statement, dictating that Muhammad and his children are neither above the law nor excluded from the rights accorded to Muslims outlined in the Quran and established by prophetic practice or Sunnah. While this seems to be the assumption in Fatima's initial inquiry, it was not unusual for Muhammad as lawmaker and prophet to have been exempted from certain Quranic injunctions or customary rules applied to the community. One example being, sorry, I've lost my place. However, in this case, the exception regarding Muhammad's license to marry more than, so one example being, however, in this case, the exception of regarding Muhammad's license to marry more than 4 wives emanates from the Quran itself, and not from the hadith, as in the case of the inheritance inheritance disputed here. To be more precise, it is this exception to the Quranic norm, allegedly originating from a hadith, which is at the heart of the dispute over fadak. Therefore, the implied logic behind the account presented by Ibn Sa'd is that Fatima, in her dispute with Abu Bakr, did not question Muhammad's authority to exempt himself from certain legal norms. Rather, the question is if Abu Bakr can exempt Muhammad from a Quranic injunction on the sole basis of his, Abu Bakr's, transmission of this prophetic hadith or the transmission of other companions. Ironically, while Fatima retains the honor and privilege of being the Prophet's daughter, it was his very exceptional relationship which prevented her, according to the sources, from enjoying the same rights to inherit that Aisha, the daughter of Abu Bakr, would enjoy. The report states that Fatima rather assumed that the portion of God, the Sahmullah, or the portion of God referred to in the Quran, was wealth and or property granted exclusively to the Prophet. Therefore, this personal property was now to be transferred to Fatima and her household, as made clearly by the statement, Ja'alahu lana, he made it for our possession. He made it for us. These items granted by God to Fatima are now, in her words, in the hands of Abu Bakr, allati biyadik, an expression seeming to imply usurpation. The telling of or retelling of Ibn Sa'd, however, reduces this usurpation of the rights of God and the Prophet in the eyes of Fatima to a misunderstanding. This Ibn Sa'd does by having Abu Bakr introduce another line of reasoning, which is found in the fact highlighted in every report he presents concerning the dispute over Muhammad's estate, except the one attached to Umhani, as previously mentioned. Prior to presenting the Fadak saga, Ibn Sa'd strategically opens his chapter on the Prophet's inheritance with 3 traditions. He quotes one tradition in which Ibn Shahab al-Zuhri, I'm not going to go into this, we don't have time to go into him. We all know he's quite an important narrator, who quotes Abu Bakr as saying, from the Prophet, we do not bequeath whatever we leave is sadaqah. In a nearly identical report, Ibn Sa'd further makes evident his traditional Sunnite historical position regarding the Prophet's estate. In this report, he cites 2 chains of transmission, one on the authority of Aisha and other numerous companions, all of them who have said, the Messenger of God said, we do not bequeath, we do not leave anything except that it is sadaqah, it is charity left for the public to benefit from, especially the poor and the needy. For Ibn Sa'd's second isnad, Malik ibn Awf Hadathan is a sole narrator. Again, I'm not going to go through all of those details, but the point is that he brings quite a few chains of transmission and traditions forward to indicate that, look, Prophet didn't leave any inheritance behind. Before venturing into the matan, as I've already mentioned, these isnads are of some historical value for those who are interested in this subject. Now, there can be no greater legitimation of a historical account for Sunnite Muslims than the agreement of such prominent personalities, meaning such prominent early companions on such a controversial issue. In this case, Ibn Sa'd even included prominent Hashemites in the isnad, such as Ali and Al-Abbas, to function as authorities verifying the tradition that the Prophet left nothing behind. Despite this incongruity, traditions guaranteed by prominent ashab have the potential power to quell or nullify charges of usurpation leveled at Abu Bakr. Thus, the Fadak saga is replete with layers of conflicting and contested truths. In spite of the accounts of Ibn Sa'd, in spite of this, the accounts of Ibn Sa'd are multivocal and to an extent multivalent in their sectarian sentiment. Thus, at this juncture, Ibn Sa'd brings in another character, Ja'far bin Abi Talib, the brother of Ali and the intimate companion of Muhammad, states in a report that in addition to Fatima initiating a claim for her inheritance to Abu Bakr, her great paternal uncle Al-Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib did so as well. The report says Ali accompanied Fatima and Al-Abbas in their audience with Abu Bakr, thereby setting the stage for a conflict between several prominent Hashemites and the non-Hashemite Abu Bakr. Why did Ibn Sa'd include this report? Even though it is much at variance with his general goal of vindicating Abu Bakr, he may have included it, as historians of his kind did, because it was circulating in connection with the controversy involving the Abbasid Caliph Al-Ma'mun, a contemporary of Ibn Sa'd, who in the year 210, 825 Common Era, convened a hearing regarding the disputed ownership of Fadak. This is the Abbasid Caliph. Both the Abbasid era historiographers, Al-Baladhuri and Al-Yaqubi, describe in almost a panegyric manner Al-Ma'mun's investigation as being motivated by his utter sincerity and desire to be near to God, taqarruban ilallah, and the Prophet, not to mention an unadulterated quest for al-adl, for justice. Therefore, in an apparent move of appeasement towards the descendants of Fatima, Al-Ma'mun pronounced Fatima's claim to inheritance as being trustworthy and ruled that it was to be given priority on the grounds that she should have been the ideal individual to be aware of her father's intentions regarding the utilization and ownership of Fadak. Having explained his reasons, Al-Ma'mun signed a caliphal decree returning Fadak to the descendants of Fatima, and in doing so passed an implicit negative judgment on Abu Bakr. The sources detailing Al-Ma'mun's return of Fadak do not mention the case of Al-Abbas. However, by legitimizing the claim of the descendants of Fatima, the caliph was also conveniently legitimizing the inheritance and the claim of his ancestor, and the source of legitimacy for the Abbasid dynasty, namely Al-Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib, the uncle of the Prophet. By placing Al-Abbas in the role of plaintiff, Ibn Sa'd and or a source make explicit what was implicit in Al-Ma'mun's decree. According to Ja'far's report, Fatima, Al-Abbas, and Ali were told that there was no inheritance for them to claim, as the Prophet did not leave anything behind which did not now belong to the public treasury. In a further bid by Ibn Sa'd to secure legitimacy for Abu Bakr and bolster his caliphal authority, he alleges that after Abu Bakr, as is usually recounted, added the remark, and he intended that for himself. He exclaimed, "Whatever the Prophet relied on for sustenance to take care of himself and his dependents is now upon me to provide for." Meaning Abu Bakr is telling Fatima or telling Ja'far and the others that, look, I'm in charge. I'm the paternal figure. I'm here to take care of you. Here Abu Bakr asserts his authority by comparing himself to the Prophet, declaring that having ascended to the leadership role now, he is now in charge of all of Muhammad's assets and consequently solely responsible. It is now upon me for its rightful dispensation, exclusively for the welfare of the Muslim community. In another report, Abu Bakr vehemently reiterates his commitment to faithfully upholding the legacy of the Prophet by referring to the Prophet's do not bequeath tradition, and mentioning that he is not altering anything, not a single iota of what the Prophet ever wanted, or his will is not being altered by Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr says, look, I'm standing in the position of the Prophet. Ibn Qutayba, in his Ta'wil Mukhtalif al-Hadith, marshals a very similar sentiment, right? Another very important early figure, right? Where he says, look, how could have Abu Bakr denied Fatima her right when he fulfilled the rights of the Ahmar and Aswad, of the red and the black, meaning that everybody got their rights? How could Abu Bakr how could any Muslim in their right mind even think or even presume or accuse Abu Bakr of not fulfilling the rights of Fatima, or intentionally denying Fatima her right, or oppressing her. And it would seem that this is the kind of common narrative in early Sunnism, or what would become early Sunnism. The Abu Bakr narrative also seemed to be aimed at asserting the patriarchal authority of Abu Bakr over Fatima. I think that this cannot be left out here. Fatima is presented to be a vulnerable, relatively uneducated woman who's portrayed to be complaining. Abu Bakr is portrayed to be a wise, patriarchal, and just father figure. So he's trying to calm her down. He's trying to settle her. He's trying to say, no, your father by God was better than me, and by God, and you are better than my daughters, right? Anti wallahi khayrun min banati. You by God are better than my own daughters. So he's trying to soothe her, but at the end of the day, he doesn't give her what she wants, right? Because he's being created or being shaped by the source to be a father-like figure, not only a father of the whole Muslim Ummah after the Prophet, that is, right, as the first caliph and the leader of the Nasiyat Muslim community, and then he says something interesting, right, in Ibn Sa'd, that he says that he's ready to accept and trust her, that if Fatima really insists that her prophet, that this land of Fadak belongs to her, he'll accept it. But Fatima's claim is entirely undermined at this point. For her only response to Abu Bakr is that the elderly Ayman told her that Muhammad had given her Fadak. So this reply of Fatima again makes her seem submissive and unaware of the importance of this matter. It is implied that despite being the daughter of Muhammad, she was not aware of her own father's will, right? She's narrating from Ayman here. And Abu Bakr, of course, tells her that, look, this is not going to work. You need two witnesses. Sorry, Fatima, I love you. You're great. You're a wonderful person. You're better than my own daughters. But he does not give her what she's asking for. So the motif of a pious yet firm caliphal authority is more evident in this report than in any other included by Ibn Sa'd. Abu Bakr plays the typical male role of the qadi or the judge and leader or an imam, while Fatima is presented as a simple-minded female plaintiff in need of paternal guidance. Fatima's femaleness becomes a negative factor in her negotiations with the wiser and older Abu Bakr, so that she is spoken to more like a child than fellow companion, endowed with knowledge of the Quran and awareness of Muhammad's final wishes, even though Muhammad was her own father. So this trope continues throughout the Sunni sources generally, right? Abu Bakr is a pious, mild-mannered man, calm, trying to calm Fatima down. She's getting upset, he's calm. It's always this kind of polarization is there throughout the sources, right? He's a righteous adjudicator, and she's just getting upset and or protesting to him, asking for what he can't give her. Secondly, for two reasons: one, because the Prophet didn't leave anything behind, and secondly, because she's, according to Islamic law, she needs the testimony of two women here in order for it to be acceptable, and Ayman alone is not sufficient. Minded that there are other sources that indicate that Ali comes to him, also argues with him and tells him, look, no, this, I don't agree with this hadith. If you look at the Quran does indicate that prophets leave behind inheritance. And at that point, Abu Bakr tells Ali that you know what you know and I know what I know. Anta ta'lamu ma ta'lamu wa ana a'lamu ma a'lam. You know what you know and I know what I know. So there is one report where Ali enters into the sphere on behalf of his wife, basically insisting that Abu Bakr, this hadith doesn't seem to make sense. But nevertheless, the overall picture that we're given is Fatima is portrayed in a sense of the typically feminine, with air quotes around there, and feeble-minded. So clearly these sources would be very contentious for Shiites that are reading it, because when we turn to Shiite tradition, especially the pietistic texts of hadith, they cast Fatima, her family, and their small band of supporters as heroes. So now we're turning to Shiism. The Shias, the early Shia and their imams are heroes facing hypocrisy and corruption. And this dualistic approach towards the Fatima and the Rashidun conflict is a product of what Maria Dakaki describes as the private eye, right, which developed an intensely dogmatic view of the companions in the context of the rise of Shiite sectarian particularism in the 2nd century. That is, the kind of inner Shiite discussions going on about the past, things that are very controversial, that a lot of other Muslims would not agree with, but still remained within Shiism. And Shiite particularism entailed the development of an electionism, defining itself against the majority of the companions of the Prophet, who Shi'is believed betrayed Muhammad's legacy and were open enemies of Fatima, Ali, and their children. This is seen in 2 particular ways. One is the khutbah of Fatima. I'm not going to go into all of that, which is which is narrated in Shi'i sources. I wouldn't say it's that famous, but it's narrated enough that scholars have picked up on it in Al-Ihtijaj, Balaghat an-Nisa, which is not necessarily a Shi'i source, it's just a source of literature. The Sharh Nahj al-Balagha of Ibn al-Hadid, al-Mu'tazili, and other sources in addition to that, where basically in this khutbah, which has been absorbed by Shi'i memory, Fatima is powerful, intelligent, and eloquent, or as I remember Todd Lawson saying in one of his articles, describing her as an early female activist of sorts. The Fatima is presented here to be powerful, authoritative in the speech to the companions of Muhammad in the city of Medina after the Prophet's death. She castigates them and says, وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مُنْقَلَبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ, essentially saying that, look, you oppressors are going to see what your result is with God. I mean, the famous sermon of Fatima becomes this total and utter castigation of the early community, essentially telling them, Taraktum kitabullah, you've abandoned the book of God, you've thrown it behind your backs, she's essentially comparing them to the mushrikun, to the polytheists. It's very profound, it's castigating. She's presented here in the Shi'i lens as being someone authoritative, eloquent, powerful, knowledgeable, someone who has a great command over the Quran, over the Arabic language. This young woman, probably 18 years old at that time, is speaking to men, twice, 3 times her age, who knows, condemning them, castigating them. This is the image of Fatima, at least from this angle, right? As an activist of sorts, standing up for herself and the rights of her husband, including herself in the imama, right? Saying imamatuna in one of the sources, our imama, which is very interesting, right? That if you're only with us, you'll be protected from disunity. Of course, this is how the memory has constructed her and it envisioned her in what would become formative Shiism. And then number 2, Shi'is present, not only Shi'is, there's some mention in non-Shi'i sources of this, but the really the explicit kind of and more very graphic, details are presented in Shi'i sources. Again, debate can be had over the isnads and those things, from the perspective of contemporary Shi'ism and looking at all the narrators of hadith. That is a different story, but early scholars like Ibn al-Qawlaway, al-Kulayni and al-Kafi, Ibn Rusum al-Tabari in Dalal al-Imama, whether it's for him or not, but we would definitely include it as being, among the early sources of Shi'i hadith, al-Ikhtisas, and other sources as well. These are just a few to name, do describe a physical attack. In some of them, it says Rafasaha birijli. I mean, not including and not discussing Sulaym ibn Qais here. Omar kicked her with his foot. I mean, that's how the Shias, or at least some Shi'i traditions, are claiming. Tusi says that it said that she was whipped. Tusi in Talkhis al-Shafi, Qadi Noman the Ismaili, again describes a very violent attack on her home in the form of poetry in Al-Urjuz al-Mukhtara. Again, two very influential and formative figures in scholastic Shiism, Qadi Nu'man for the Ismailis, Sheikh Tusi for the Imami Twelvers, both describing a very violent and attack on her home. Fatima is then laid to rest in a secret and somber ceremony. At this juncture, I would use Amir Moizi's description as Shiism as being a religion set apart. I'm just going to wrap up here. I think that Moizi's description as Shiism being a religion set apart really really applies to the case of Fatima as a motif of contention and suffering in Shiism. There is really no possible reconciliation in what would become formative Shiism and formative Sunnism once these narratives are solidified by the 3rd and the 4th centuries, or the 10th and 11th centuries of the Common Era in the Shi'i case. Unlike the case of Sunnism, the Shiite hadith makes no attempt to digest or negotiate this conflict between Muhammad's daughter and his closest associates. Rather, Abu Bakr, Umar, and their supporters are presented as tyrants who not only usurped the leadership of the community from Fatima's husband Ali and denied her claim to the land of Fadak, but were guilty of physically assaulting the daughter of the Prophet. Again, I wouldn't say all Shi'is believe this, but it is commonly reported, commonly mentioned by Shi'i scholars. So clearly there was a memory about this. Saduq mentions this as well. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Tusi claims that there's no khilaf between the Shias on this issue. And the reports are famous enough, in his view, in the Sunni traditions, to support at least elements or parts of the Shi'i claim. And as I mentioned, Fadlallah himself, at the end of his book, does mention, he makes it very clear, and there is no doubt in our mind that Fatima was Mathaluma, and she was oppressed and by the early community, by people who are the heroes of Sunni Islam. So it should be emphasized that the belief in the suffering of Fatima and her violent conflict with the companions cannot be dismissed as being limited to the fringes of popular Shiism. As many accounts are found in mainstream Shiite hadith tradition and in books of Shi'i, theologians and scholars. Well into the modern period, right? I mean, we have numerous works by people like Jafar Subhani and others. Of course, everything is to be debated. I'm just simply saying that it is a very popular and commonly accepted view in Shiite sources and by Shiite scholars, which have a very sober worldview in which God friends are few and his enemies are many, where for Sunnis, the view is much more conciliatory and left to a misunderstanding. If there was a dispute between the companions, it is not as it seems, as Ibn Qutayba says, meaning he was clearly responding to the Shiite usage of these events as an instance of caliphal impropriety on the part of Abu Bakr. So there are two different pasts that have been constructed, contested, and imagined using both similar but varying details. So some of the details are similar but interpreted differently, and some of the details are just different altogether. Hence we have two very different visions of the past, which then contribute to the formation of two distinct religious and sectarian identities. Thank you very much.
Vinay, thank you very much. This was a fascinating talk, supremely interesting, and also beautifully crafted as a talk, as yes, it was how you built it up. Thank you, and also thank you for your introduction, which was very edifying. So maybe before we turn to the questions, please allow me to mention once more the two talks coming next week. I would encourage you, everyone, to register as right after this talk to Parvane's and Hafsa's talks next week, and then yeah, to quote, yeah, to be inspired by your talk. I have my questions, but you have your questions as well. So please come up with them and ask them to Vinay. And yeah, I before I forget, I stop the recording so that we can be absolutely free in asking those questions.